The full moon cast long shadows across the Savannah River on that humid August night in 1847. In the darkness, four figures moved silently through the cotton fields toward an abandoned chapel, their footsteps muffled by the soft Georgia soil. What they were about to do would shatter every law, every custom, every unspoken rule of the antebellum South. This is the story of the Georgia twins who dared to marry their own enslaved men, a forbidden pact that would echo through generations as one of the most dramatic and hidden stories of American slavery. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what you're about to hear was deliberately erased from history books. A story so dangerous that those who knew it took it to their graves rather than speak it aloud. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Georgian farmland, its white columned mansion rising from the red earth like a monument to Southern prosperity. Built in 1812 by Colonel James Whitmore, the estate represented everything the antebellum South aspired to be: elegant, refined, and built entirely on the backs of 137 enslaved human beings. The morning routines began before dawn, with field hands moving toward the cotton rows, while house servants prepared for another day of maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury. The kitchen fires were lit by 4 in the morning, the silver polished before the family woke, the floors swept clean of any evidence that this paradise required constant, back-breaking labor to exist. Sarah and Emma Whitmore, identical twins born in 1825, had grown up in this carefully constructed world. Their father, now widowed, had raised them with all the privileges their station afforded: French tutors, piano lessons, silk dresses imported from Charleston, and the unquestioned assumption that the black faces surrounding them existed solely for their comfort and service. Yet something in the twins had always been different. Perhaps it was their mother's influence before her death from yellow fever when they were 12, a woman who had quietly taught her daughters to see the humanity in everyone, though she never dared speak such sentiments openly. Or perhaps it was simply that Sarah and Emma, blessed and cursed with identical faces and minds that mirrored each other's thoughts, had developed their own private world, where the rules of society held less sway than the bonds they felt with certain individuals society told them not to see as people at all. The story truly began in the summer of 1845, when the twins were 20 years old. Their father had purchased 2 new enslaved men from a failing plantation in South Carolina, Marcus and David, brothers who had been separated from their family and sold together only because the seller knew they worked better as a pair. Marcus was 25, tall and broad-shouldered from years in the rice fields, with eyes that held a dignity no amount of degradation could extinguish. David, 2 years younger, possessed a sharp intelligence that he had learned to hide behind a mask of compliance, though those who looked closely could see the calculations always running behind his careful expression. They were assigned to work in the house, Marcus as a footman and David in the stables, positions that brought them into daily contact with the Whitmore family. The initial attraction was so subtle that even the twins themselves didn't recognize it at first. Sarah found herself lingering in the dining room when Marcus served meals, ostensibly checking the silver, but really studying the grace with which he moved, the careful way he never met anyone's eyes directly, yet seemed to see everything. Emma discovered reasons to visit the stables more frequently, claiming an increased interest in riding that coincidentally required David's assistance. These stolen moments accumulated like droplets of water on a leaf, seemingly insignificant, until suddenly the weight became undeniable. The first real conversation happened by accident, or perhaps by the kind of fate that operates through accumulated coincidences. Sarah had ventured to the library late one evening and found Marcus there, dustcloth in hand, carefully cleaning the leather-bound volumes. In the South of 1845, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal, punishable by fines and imprisonment for the teacher, and brutal whipping, or worse, for the student. Yet Marcus was running his fingers along the spines with a reverence that spoke of longing. Sarah should have left immediately. Instead, she found herself asking quietly if he could read. The silence that followed was heavy with danger. Marcus's hand stilled on the books. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said he had learned as a child, before he understood it was forbidden, taught by an old woman who had somehow kept the secret skill alive through decades of bondage. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled a volume of poetry from the shelf and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, the first time they had ever touched, and the shock of that simple contact would haunt them both. Emma's moment came weeks later when a storm spooked the horses, and she found herself genuinely frightened in the stables. David calmed not just the animals but her as well. speaking in a low, soothing voice about his childhood, about the songs his mother used to sing before she was sold away, about the way storms in South Carolina smelled different from those in Georgia. Emma had never heard an enslaved person speak so freely, had never considered they had memories and stories and mothers they missed. When the storm passed, she didn't leave. They talked until the danger of discovery forced them apart, but something fundamental had shifted. The twins, who shared everything, found themselves sharing this secret too. They were falling in love with men the world told them were property, not people. By the winter of 1846, the relationships had deepened beyond anything that could be dismissed as passing fancy. The twins had begun taking dangerous risks, arranging secret meetings in the abandoned overseer's cottage at the edge of the property, a building that had stood empty since a fire had damaged it years before. Sarah would claim to be visiting Emma in her room. Emma would say she was with Sarah, and both would slip away to spend precious hours with Marcus and David. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams that could never be realized, planning futures that could never exist. Marcus spoke of the sister he hadn't seen in 10 years, sold to Virginia when she was 14. David revealed his ability to calculate numbers in his head, a skill he had hidden because intelligence in an enslaved person was seen as dangerous. The twins reciprocated with their own secrets, their own dreams of a world different from the one they inhabited. The first kiss between Sarah and Marcus happened on Christmas Eve, 1846. The main house was busy with preparations for the annual party, and in the chaos, they had managed to steal away to the old chapel that stood at the edge of the property, a remnant from the plantation's earliest days. Snow, rare in Georgia, had begun to fall, transforming the landscape into something otherworldly. In that sacred space, with its broken windows and vine-covered walls, Sarah reached for Marcus's face, her gloved hands trembling not from cold, but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. When their lips met, it was with the desperate hunger of people who know their time is borrowed, that every moment together is theft from a world that would destroy them for this simple human connection. Emma and David's first kiss came a week later, on New Year's Eve, as the sound of celebration drifted from the big house. They stood by the river, watching the moonlight dance on the water, when David took her hand and spoke the words that would seal their fate. He told her he loved her, that he knew it was impossible, that he knew it could cost him his life, but that some truths demanded to be spoken even if they led to destruction. Emma's response was to pull him close and kiss him with all the passion and desperation of someone who has finally found what they didn't know they were searching for. Even as they understand, it cannot last. The idea of marriage came from Emma, always the more impulsive of the twins. She had been reading about the old Celtic hand-fasting traditions, ceremonies that required no church, no official sanction, only the commitment of two souls before nature and whatever God might be watching. If the law wouldn't recognize their unions, if society would condemn them, then they would create their own sacred bonds. Sarah initially resisted, understanding the danger more clearly, but Emma's passion was infectious. They would marry the men they loved, even if that marriage existed only in their own hearts and the eyes of God. But something was building, a tension in the household that suggested their secret was not as well kept as they believed. The overseer, Thomas Crawford, had noticed the twins' strange behaviors, their unexplained absences. More dangerously, he had noticed the way Marcus and David carried themselves lately, a subtle straightening of shoulders, a light in their eyes that suggested hope. And hope, in enslaved people, was the most dangerous thing of all. The pressure began to build in the spring of 1847. Colonel Whitmore announced that he had begun arrangements for his daughter's marriages to the Buchanan brothers, wealthy planters from Alabama, whose holdings would unite with the Whitmore estate to create one of the largest agricultural empires in the South. The twins' protests were dismissed as maiden nervousness. The date was set for August. Sarah and Emma knew their time had run out. If they were to be forced into marriages with men they didn't love, they would at least first bind themselves to the men they did. The planning required incredible care, and not a small amount of help from unexpected sources. Mama Rose, the elderly cook who had raised the twins after their mother's death, had long suspected something, but had kept her silence. When Emma finally, desperately, confided in her, Rose's response was unexpected. She spoke of her own lost love, a man sold away 30 years ago, and of the ceremony they had performed in secret, jumping the broom in the slave quarters while their friends stood watch. She would help them, she said, because love was the only thing in this horrible world that made life worth living, and if the twins had found it, who was she to stand in its way? The date was set for August 15, 1847, 3 days before the twins were to leave for Alabama to prepare for their official weddings. Rose spread word carefully among the most trusted members of the enslaved community, those who could be counted on to keep the secret. Old Joseph, who tended the chapel grounds, ensured the building would be clean and ready. Martha, who did the household laundry, prepared simple white dresses that could pass for nightgowns if discovered. Even Benjamin, the stable boy who hero-worshipped David, stood ready to keep watch. The night arrived heavy with humidity and significance. The twins told their father they were retiring early, overwhelmed by preparations for their upcoming nuptials. Marcus and David claimed illness, staying in their quarters instead of serving at dinner. One by one, shadows slipped through the darkness toward the chapel. If this story moves your soul, support with your subscription and leave your voice in the comments, because these stories of forbidden love and impossible courage deserve to be remembered. Inside the chapel, transformed by candles and wild flowers, a ceremony unlike any other was taking place. There was no priest, but old Joseph spoke words from the Bible he had memorized over decades of secret services. There were no legal documents, but Sarah had written vows on paper she would later burn. Words that spoke of love that transcended law and convention. Marcus and Sarah stood before the makeshift altar first, hands clasped, speaking promises that could cost them their lives. Marcus's voice was steady as he vowed to love her in this life and the next, in freedom or bondage, in safety or danger. Sarah's tears fell freely as she promised to honor him as her husband, her equal, her beloved, regardless of what the world might say. They jumped the broom, that tradition from the slave quarters given new meaning in this strange union, and Rose pronounced them married in the eyes of God if not the law. Emma and David followed, their ceremony equally moving and dangerous. David spoke of how Emma had given him back his humanity, had made him remember he was a man with a heart and soul, not merely hands to work and a back to whip. Emma declared that David was already free in her eyes, that their love was the truest freedom either would ever know. As they kissed, sealing their forbidden union, thunder rumbled in the distance, as if the very heavens were commenting on what had just occurred. But the universe had a cruel sense of timing. Even as the two couples embraced, even as the small congregation of witnesses wiped tears from their eyes, a figure watched from the shadows outside the chapel. Crawford, the overseer, had followed his suspicions and found more than he had ever imagined. His face, illuminated briefly by lightning, showed not just shock, but a kind of triumph. He had discovered a secret that would give him power over the richest family in the county. Crawford didn't act immediately. He waited, letting the couples return separately to the plantation, letting them believe their secret was safe. He spent 3 days considering his options, weighing the benefits of blackmail against the rewards of revelation. In the end, his racism won out over his greed. The thought of white women, even if they were above his own social station, sullying themselves with black men was more than his prejudices could bear. He went directly to Colonel Whitmore with what he had seen. The explosion was immediate and terrible. Colonel Whitmore's rage was a living thing, filling the house like smoke from a fire. He summoned his daughters to his study, and their faces told him everything he needed to know. The confrontation was brief and brutal. He didn't ask for explanations because he didn't want to hear them. He didn't ask for apologies because they wouldn't have mattered. He simply informed them that Marcus and David would be sold immediately to the furthest buyer he could find, that the twins would be sent to a convent in Charleston until their marriages to the Buchanan brothers, and that if they ever spoke of this again, he would have the men killed rather than merely sold. Sarah tried to throw herself at her father's feet, begging, pleading, offering anything if he would just show mercy. Emma stood frozen, her face white as paper, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. Their father's response was to have them locked in their rooms, windows boarded, doors guarded. That night, Marcus and David were chained in the barn, awaiting the slave traders who would arrive with dawn. But that night, something else broke the silence of the plantation. The enslaved community, those who had witnessed the weddings and those who had only heard whispers, began to gather outside the barn. They didn't speak, didn't sing, didn't protest in any way that could be punished. They simply stood vigil, a silent testimony to what was about to happen. Rose brought food to the imprisoned men, risking brutal punishment to offer what comfort she could. She carried with her a message from Sarah, written in charcoal on a scrap of cloth. "You are my husband, forever." Emma's message to David was even simpler. "Wait for me in the next life." The dawn came too soon, bringing with it the slave traders from New Orleans. These were hard men who specialized in difficult sales, men who asked no questions about why prime field hands were being sold so urgently. Marcus and David were brought out in chains, and that's when Sarah and Emma made their last desperate play. The twins had managed to break free from their rooms, using a lifetime's knowledge of the house's secrets, passages, and hidden keys. They burst into the yard just as Marcus and David were being loaded onto the wagon. Sarah ran to Marcus, throwing her arms around him in full view of everyone, declaring before God and man that he was her husband. Emma did the same with David, shouting that she would rather die than live without him. The scene that followed was chaos. Colonel Whitmore ordered his daughters physically restrained. The overseer and several field hands were commanded to pull the women away from their husbands. The slave traders watched with a mixture of disgust and fascination, having never seen such a display. Marcus tried to fight back, but was beaten down with rifle butts. David submitted quietly, his eyes never leaving Emma's face, memorizing every detail for the long journey ahead. As the wagon pulled away, Sarah broke free one last time and ran after it, her white nightgown billowing behind her like a ghost. She managed to grab Marcus's hand through the bars of the cage, running alongside until her strength gave out and she fell to the dusty ground. Emma stood at the gate, screaming David's name until her voice gave out, until her father had her dragged bodily back to the house. The last thing the men saw as they disappeared down the long drive was the twins being forced back into their prison, and the enslaved community still standing in silent witness to this tragedy. The immediate aftermath was swift and merciless. Every enslaved person who had participated in or witnessed the ceremony was punished. Rose received 20 lashes that left her back a map of scars. Old Joseph was sold to a neighboring plantation. Martha was sent to work in the fields despite her advanced age. The chapel itself was burned to the ground on Colonel Whitmore's orders, its ashes scattered to the wind. The twins were indeed sent to the convent in Charleston, but they lasted barely a month before their father received word that they had fallen mysteriously ill and could no longer remain. The truth was that they had refused all food, growing so weak the nuns feared they would die. Faced with the potential scandal of his daughters dying in religious custody, Colonel Whitmore had them brought home. What he found when they returned shocked him more than their original transgression. The twins had always been identical, but now they looked like two versions of the same ghost. Their hair, once golden, had turned prematurely gray at the temples. Their eyes, once bright with life, were hollow and distant. They spoke only to each other, and only in whispers. They ate just enough to survive. They sat by windows staring at the road, as if waiting for something they knew would never come. The marriages to the Buchanan brothers were quietly canceled, the official reason given as delicate health. In truth, the brothers had heard rumors of the scandal and wanted no part of it. The twins had become unmarriageable, tainted by their transgression in ways that no amount of money could overcome. Colonel Whitmore tried everything to restore his daughters to their former selves. He brought in doctors from Atlanta who prescribed tonics and rest cures. He hired companions to engage them in conversation and activity. He even, in desperation, offered to try to find and buy back Marcus and David. But by then, the trail had gone cold. The slave traders had sold them in New Orleans as promised. But from there they had vanished into the vast network of slavery that stretched across the South. They could have been anywhere from Texas to Florida, alive or dead. No way to know. The uncertainty was perhaps worse than knowing they were gone forever. As months turned to years, the Whitmore plantation began to decline. Colonel Whitmore, distracted by his daughter's condition and the shame of the scandal, neglected his business affairs. The overseer Crawford, who had revealed the secret, was found dead one morning in his cottage, apparently of natural causes, though some whispered of poison. The enslaved community worked, but without the efficiency that had once made the plantation profitable. It was as if the entire estate was under a curse, punishment for the cruelty of separating those who loved each other. Sarah was the first to show signs of recovery, if it could be called that. She began visiting the quarters where the enslaved families lived, bringing medicine and extra food, teaching the children to read in defiance of the law. When her father tried to stop her, she simply looked at him with those hollow eyes and said that she had already lost everything that mattered. So what more could he take from her? He had no answer to that. Emma took a different path. She began writing, filling journal after journal with her memories of David, of their brief time together, of the ceremony in the chapel. She wrote letters to him that could never be sent, telling him about her days, about her dreams, about her undying love. These writings would later become the primary source for historians trying to piece together this story. though many of the journals were destroyed by family members who wanted to bury the shame. But some survived, hidden in the walls of the old house, discovered only decades later during renovations. In 1850, 3 years after the forced separation, news came via the Underground Railroad. A message, passed from person to person, state to state, finally reached Rose, who had recovered from her punishment and remained at the plantation. Marcus had died of yellow fever on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. He had never stopped trying to escape, had been punished repeatedly for his attempts, and had finally succumbed to disease weakened by years of brutal treatment. His last words, according to the message, were Sarah's name. Rose debated whether to tell Sarah, but in the end, she decided the truth, however painful, was better than uncertainty. Sarah received the news with strange calm. She simply nodded, walked to her room, and didn't emerge for 3 days. When she finally came out, she was wearing black, mourning clothes she would wear for the rest of her life. David's fate remained unknown for another 2 years. Then, in 1852, a traveling preacher who ministered to enslaved communities brought word. David had escaped. He had made it to Canada via the Underground Railroad and was living free in Toronto. He had sent numerous messages trying to find out what had happened to Emma, but none had been able to penetrate the wall of silence around the Whitmore plantation. The preacher carried with him a letter, sewn into the lining of his coat, that David had written to Emma. In it, he told her he was free, that he thought of her every day, that he would wait for her forever if necessary. He begged her to find a way to come north, promising they could be legally married in Canada, could live as husband and wife without fear. Emma's response to this news was even more dramatic than Sarah's had been to Marcus's death. She immediately began planning an escape, not just for herself but for Sarah too. The twins had never been separated, and Emma refused to leave her sister behind. They spent months in preparation, secretly selling jewelry and accumulating money, studying maps, making contacts with the Underground Railroad. But their plans were discovered by their father just days before they were to leave. His response was to have Emma committed to an asylum in Milledgeville, claiming she had gone mad from hysteria. Sarah, faced with the choice of abandoning her escape to stay near her sister or leaving Emma behind, chose to stay. The asylum was a nightmare of ice baths, restraints, and treatments designed to cure women of independence and inappropriate desires. Emma survived by retreating into herself, creating an internal world where she and David lived together in freedom. She stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through drawings of birds, which she produced obsessively. Birds in flight, birds in cages, birds with broken wings trying to soar. The doctors considered this progress, a channeling of her hysteria into acceptable feminine accomplishment. They didn't understand that each bird was a message, a prayer, a promise that her spirit remained unbroken even as her body was confined. Sarah, meanwhile, waged a quiet war to free her sister. She managed the plantation's finances, having learned enough from years of observation to take over when her father's health began to fail. She used the profits to bribe doctors, lawyers, anyone who might help Emma's case. It took 3 years, but finally in 1855, she succeeded in having Emma released into her custody, though the conditions were strict. Emma was to remain at the plantation under constant supervision, taking daily medications that left her drowsy and compliant. Share this story, because while even one voice remembers, no injustice will be forgotten. These women who dared to love deserve to have their courage remembered. The twins were reunited but forever changed. Sarah, dressed perpetually in mourning black, had become a strange figure of both tragedy and defiance. She continued her work in the quarters, teaching enslaved children to read, providing medical care, creating a school that operated in secret. Emma, when the medications wore off enough for her to be lucid, would join her, teaching the children songs and stories, giving them the gift of imagination as a form of resistance. The sisters never spoke directly of Marcus and David in these later years, but their presence haunted every moment. Sarah would sometimes pause in the middle of a sentence, her hand going to a locket at her throat that contained a lock of Marcus's hair, the only physical reminder she had of him. Emma would stare at birds in flight and whisper words no one could hear, messages perhaps to David across the impossible distance between them. The Civil War changed everything and nothing. When emancipation came, the newly freed people of the Whitmore plantation were offered wages to stay and work. Many did, not out of loyalty to the family, but to Sarah and Emma, who had shown them kindness when kindness could have cost everything. The twins opened their school officially, scandalizing the county by teaching black and white children together. They used their remaining wealth to help formerly enslaved people buy land, start businesses, flee north if they chose. but they never searched for David, even though he was now free to return. Emma said she couldn't bear to see him after all that had happened, that she wasn't the woman he had loved anymore. The asylum and the medications had taken too much from her. She wanted him to remember her as she had been on their wedding night, young and fierce and full of hope. Colonel Whitmore died in 1863, never having reconciled with his daughters, never having forgiven them for choosing love over duty, passion over propriety. On his deathbed, he called for them, perhaps to offer forgiveness or ask for it, but they didn't come. They were in the quarters, helping deliver a baby, choosing life over death, future over past. He died alone except for a paid nurse, his last words reportedly being a question: "What did I do wrong?" The answer died with him, though everyone who knew the story could have told him. He had tried to regulate love, to control hearts, to deny the fundamental humanity of the people he claimed to own. His punishment was losing his daughters, not to death, but to principle, watching them choose justice over family, love over law. In the years after the war, stories began to emerge from other plantations, other states. The twins hadn't been alone in their forbidden loves. There had been others, many others, who had risked everything for relationships that crossed the color line. Some had been discovered and punished even more severely. Some had managed to escape north together. Some had lived their entire lives in secret, taking their stories to graves. But Sarah and Emma's story became legendary because of its public nature, because of the ceremony in the chapel, because of the dramatic separation and its aftermath. Former enslaved people who had witnessed the weddings told the story to their children as proof that love could exist even in the most impossible circumstances. They spoke of the dignity of Marcus and David, who had faced their fate with courage. They remembered the twins running after the wagon, their desperate declarations of love, their refusal to deny what they felt even when denial might have saved everyone. Sarah lived until 1889, dying at the age of 64. She never married, never showed interest in any other man. She spent her final years writing her own account of the events, though this manuscript was destroyed by relatives who wanted to preserve the family reputation. On her deathbed, she asked to be buried in the black section of the cemetery, next to Rose, who had died 5 years earlier. Her request was denied by the law, but some say that on certain nights, her ghost can be seen walking from the white section to the black section, still trying to bridge the gap that separated her from those she loved. Emma survived her sister by only 6 months. The day Sarah died, Emma stopped taking her medications, stopped eating, stopped speaking except to say one word: soon. She spent her last months sitting by the window, watching birds, drawing with charcoal on any surface she could find. After her death, they found hundreds of drawings hidden throughout her room. All of them were of the same subject: 2 birds flying together toward the sun, finally free. In her hand when she died was a piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was part of David's letter from Canada, the part where he had written, "I will wait for you forever." Below it, in Emma's shaky hand, were the words, "I'm coming." The Whitmore plantation was sold after Emma's death, the house eventually burning down in 1892 under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was lightning, others suspected arson by those who wanted to erase the shameful history. But before it burned, a photographer documenting the post-war South captured an image that would become iconic. It showed the ruins of the chapel where the weddings had taken place, overgrown with vines, but still standing. In the foreground, barely visible, were 4 figures in white, translucent as morning mist. Skeptics said it was a double exposure, a photographic error. But those who knew the story recognized them immediately. Sarah and Marcus, Emma and David, together at last, in the only way they could be. The historical record of these events was deliberately suppressed for decades. Southern historians didn't want to acknowledge that such relationships had existed, that white women had chosen black men not through coercion, but through love. Northern historians found the story too complicated, too nuanced for the simple narrative of evil slaveholders and noble enslaved people. The story didn't fit anyone's agenda, which is perhaps why it rings so true. It wasn't until the 1960s that scholars began to piece together the full narrative from scattered sources. Emma's surviving journals hidden in the walls, court records of the twins' commitment proceedings, letters from former enslaved people who had witnessed the ceremonies, David's freedom papers in Canadian archives that listed his wife as Emma, location unknown. What emerges from these fragments is a story more complex than any fiction. It's about love, yes, but also about the systems designed to make love impossible. It's about courage, but also about the price of that courage paid not just by those who loved, but by entire communities punished for keeping secrets. It's about the particular cruelty of slavery that didn't just steal labor and freedom, but attempted to steal the very capacity for human connection. And it's about resistance, not with guns or rebellions, but with the simple, revolutionary act of insisting on one's full humanity, of demanding the right to love and be loved. The story of the Georgia twins forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. It reveals that the racial categories that seem so fixed were actually maintained through violence and law, not nature. It shows that there were white people who recognized the humanity of enslaved people so fully that they were willing to sacrifice everything for love. And it demonstrates that the enslaved community, far from being passive victims, were active agents in their own stories, creating ceremonies, keeping secrets, maintaining dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. But perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that love has always been political. The decision of who can love whom can marry whom, whose relationships are recognized and whose are criminalized, these have never been private matters but public battlegrounds. Sarah and Marcus, Emma and David, they weren't just lovers. They were revolutionaries. Their chapel ceremony wasn't just a wedding. It was an act of rebellion against an entire social order. Their love wasn't just personal. It was a threat to the very foundations of a society built on the premise that some humans were less human than others. Today, when we think about the couples separated at the auction block, the families torn apart by slavery, we often focus on the enslaved families destroyed by the system, and we should. But the story of the Georgia twins reminds us that slavery destroyed white families too, that the poison of racism infected even those who benefited from it. Colonel Whitmore lost his daughters not to death or distance, but to his own inability to see the humanity in Marcus and David. He died alone and bewildered because he couldn't understand that love doesn't recognize the boundaries we create, that hearts don't see color the way laws do. The final tragedy of this story is how many others like it have been lost. How many secret ceremonies took place in hidden places? How many couples were separated for the crime of loving across racial lines? How many women were committed to asylums? How many men were sold away or killed for these forbidden relationships? We'll never know the full extent because shame and fear kept these stories buried. Families destroyed records. Communities maintained silence. Historians looked the other way. But every now and then, a story like Sarah and Emma's emerges from the shadows, demanding to be heard, refusing to be forgotten. As we reflect on this history, we must ask ourselves what forbidden loves exist in our own time. What couples are we separating through law or custom? What love are we calling illegal or immoral simply because it challenges our assumptions about how society should be ordered? The chapel where Sarah and Marcus, Emma and David exchanged their vows may be ruins, but the questions their love raised remain urgent and alive. They challenge us to examine our own prejudices, our own systems of oppression, our own failures to recognize the full humanity of every person. The story ends where it began, with four figures moving through the darkness toward love, toward each other, toward a freedom that existed only in their hearts, but was no less real for being impossible. They knew the price they would pay. They paid it anyway. And in doing so, they left us this legacy: that love is stronger than law, that human connection transcends artificial boundaries, that there is something in the human spirit that refuses to be owned, categorized, or controlled. Their marriages lasted only one night in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of eternity, Sarah and Marcus, Emma and David remain married still. Their love, a testament to the power of the human heart to resist even the most brutal attempts to deny its capacity to choose whom to love. This is their story, rescued from the silence of shame and the violence of forgetting. This is their monument, built not of stone but of words, not of marble but of memory. And this is their victory, that despite every attempt to erase them, to deny their love, to punish their courage, we still speak their names: Sarah and Marcus, Emma and David. Four people who dared to love in a time when love itself was rebellion, who chose each other in a world that said they couldn't, who proved that even in the depths of history's greatest cruelties, love finds a way to declare itself, to insist on its own existence, to demand recognition even when recognition means destruction. If this story has touched your soul, share it with others who need to hear it. Subscribe to hear more hidden histories, more forgotten stories of courage and resistance. Leave your thoughts in the comments about what this story means to you. about the loves in your own family history that might have been forbidden or forgotten. Because every time we tell these stories, every time we speak these names, we strike a blow against the forces that would make us forget. We honor those who loved at impossible cost. We remember that love has always been revolutionary, always been dangerous to those who would control it. And we commit ourselves to the ongoing work of making sure that no love need be hidden, no ceremony need be secret, no couple need be separated because of who they are or whom they choose to love. This is the legacy of the Georgia twins and their enslaved husbands, that love will not be owned, cannot be chained, and shall not be forgotten.